Chapter 11. Cat and Mouse. There I sat, on the throne of Wonderland again, alone with nothing to do but think. I thought about how vital the success of these missions was. If the call to arms was not answered, we would be left with little hope. And if the cat and mouse failed to find the pieces that light the way to Wonderhaven and its weapon, we would have no hope at all. I thought of how I followed Alice's path, step for step, on my first adventure here. I wondered if she were here, where I was, how she would handle the end of this world, our world. The more I thought, the more I could see the caterpillar's talk of change taking shape. If we won, then Wonderland and everything in it would brace itself for its next darkest day, when it slithered about and bared its teeth. I wondered how this change would affect my friends, the Queen and her rule. Would they become like the monsters they stood up against? If we lost, all of Wonderland would be swallowed by the darkness, by darkness so void, even the purest of heart would fail to see light. Both scenarios left this place unrecognizable. That was the scariest part of all of this. Not the war and all the casualties to come, but the worry of the unknown that was painted on everyone's face. The unavoidable fact that the days of a free and happy Wonderland were over, that we would face natural selection or extinction. At some point during all this wondering, I turned my attention to the vorpal blade. For whatever reason, as I played with it in my hand, I got lost in the reflection. I stared lifelessly into the face staring back at me, hoping he would have all the answers I needed. It was then, looking into the sheen of the blade, that I began to speak aloud. O mighty beast slayer, how many more will you vanquish before weapon and wielder both expire? Hoping the blade would answer me back, I looked harder, longer, into it. Instead of the blade becoming sentient and speaking, it showed me another reflection next to mine. A timid creature holding a teacup. I quickly looked over my shoulder to see the March Hare standing in the dining hall doorway. Once I noticed him, he took a few steps forward, with ears laid back, as he asked, in a shaky tone, Would you care for some tea, Alan? Seeing my friend made me smile as I replied, It's very nice of you to ask, but I don't think right now is the best time for tea. Instead of the March Hare responding, our conversation was interrupted by voices from behind him. First, it was Dee who appeared on his left that said, It's the perfect time for tea. Then it was Dum who appeared on his right that continued, With all due respect, Alan, this may be the only time we have left for tea. As the four of us hung on those words for a second, I put my blade away, and with a sigh, I accepted the cup. While they all took their places encircling me, I saw just how important taking this time really was. Not only did it allow us time to mourn our dear friend properly, but it gave us time to bask in each other's company before we faced the battle together. What started in an awkward silence grew into laughter and lightheartedness. Time seemed to move quicker as we made every attempt to grab the fragments of joy that rained down on us in our conversation. However, just as this blissful happiness began to flood our circle, it was drained out. Our small tea party was interrupted by the sight of the Cheshire Cat sprinting into the room with the Dormouse in tow. We all turned our attention to our new guests as they approached, very curious to see what the two had to report. "Forgive us for interrupting your social time, but we found something you're going to want to see," Chesh purred. "Yeah, it may be exactly what you're looking for," Dormouse added happily. Tea," he said indirectly as he caught sight of our cups. "You found the door, then?" I asked excitedly. "It's likely," Chesh replied in annoyance, as he struggled to keep the mouse out of the tea that March Hare was more than happy to give him. "Follow us quickly, if you would, please." As the cat whipped around, getting control of the mouse's urges, I sprang up from the throne and addressed the March Hare and Tweedles. "Stay here and keep an eye out for our new arrivals." With that, the two animals scurried off, and I followed close behind. My mind seemed to be racing faster than my legs as we zigzagged through hallways and dashed through doorways. I became more awash with emotions with every step closer we came. There was the excitement for what there was to find. Would I be the first non-royalty to see the myth of Wonderhaven stand true? There was nervousness also. What if the door they found was just a decoy, and the real one still lay undiscovered? In such dire times as these, the undetermined was very frightening. But I knew what I believed, and I knew what I believed, what I needed to be true. Somewhere hidden within this magnificent fortress stood a door of equal prowess. My question wasn't if they had found the door, but rather where they had found it. Eventually, after tailing the clever creatures through a maze of rooms and other structural marvels that I had never seen, we came to a stop briefly on top of a wide staircase that led deep underneath the castle. There was no mistaking where we would go next, the dungeon. While the cat and mouse trotted onward and downward without hesitation, I didn't find myself so free. I'd been given reason to take caution in darkness. I'd seen what it could do unrestrained. The descent was quickly becoming nothing more than a mental game. I knew that the darkness we were walking into had as much place in the world as the warm light that accompanied the sun each day, but I still kept a hand on the hilt of my blade nonetheless. Reaching the bottom of the staircase and peering into the blackness, Chesh noticed my uneasiness and commented, in a sarcastic tone, "Relax, sire. There's nothing down here but age-old cobwebs." Ignoring him with a displeased grunt, I turned my focus to adding some light to our environment. Lighting a torch and removing it from the wall allowed me to see just how cold and unforgiving this place was, so unlike the queen and the rest of her castle. It really had no differences compared to the one she was being held in with the black royalty, aside from being smaller and way underused. We walked through a block of cells, two on each side to be exact, and at the end of the aisle stood a stone wall marking a dead end. As we approached the wall, the Dormouse spoke up. "I bet you're wondering how we managed to find it all the way down here, eh?" In slight puzzlement, I replied. I was beginning to. Taking obvious pleasure in his detective skills, Dormouse answered, "Well, you told us yourself to look in places that were out of plain sight. What place in the whole kingdom is more out of sight for the queen than the damp and hellish dungeon she hardly uses?" I didn't verbally respond, but I shrugged to show he had a point. When the three of us stopped in front of the wall, he continued. We searched high and low in every nook and cranny, specifically that wall's nooks and crannies. While the mouse giggled childishly to himself for that remark, I stepped forward. Knowing that this wall wasn't likely to be a wall at all, I began running my hands up and down, sliding my fingers along every available crack in the stone in hopes of activating a mechanism. With lucky hand placement, I did just that. I pushed on a stone in the upper left, and as it sunk into the wall, it quickly jetted back out. I took a step back as an unlocking sound rumbled within the wall, but did nothing more. Confused, I stood there, looking for another solution. It's a puzzle, Alan. Use the room to find the answer, Chesh said, hoping to offer aid. Hearing his advice, I spun around and started looking around the room. Coincidentally, there wasn't a whole lot to see in that grimy dungeon other than the 4 cells. Looking between them and the wall, I discovered a pattern. The stone already pushed in matched the placement of the cell furthest away from us on the left side. I then strategically ran my hand directly down from that spot and found another movable stone. As it unlocked, I knew I was onto something and placed my hand across from the first stone. This represented the cell furthest away on the right side. While the third lock shifted, I placed my hand below it and found the 4th stone. I took another step back and noticed that the stone mechanisms were mapped out in a square formation on the wall. Seconds later, we all took a step back as the final mechanism holding the wall in place let loose. The square on the wall separated from its hole and slid over to the left. What hid behind it was a long and narrow pathway to a door on the end. Without a word, Chesh took the lead once again. As we approached the door, I impatiently asked, "Where does this lead?" With a devilish grin, Chesh replied, "To the door." He then put a paw on the door and pushed it open. What waited on the other side was awe-inspiring. A ginormous room with shelves as far as the eye could see, adorning either a diamond or a heart. They housed thousands and thousands of books, floor to ceiling. Lavish red and gold carpet blanketed our every step. It truly looked as if we had walked through a door leaving White's castle and had ended up somewhere completely new and different. Awestruck by my new surroundings, I asked, "Whose library is this?" "It must have belonged to the bishop," Chesh answered, doing his best to keep me on task while he spoke. He was Red and White's teacher and a scholar of Wonderland's histories, what is written and what was still to be. The king used his knowledge to aid him against foes during his time on the throne. "What happened to him?" I asked in a tone of concern. "Well, much like most of the king's allies, he was killed," Chesh replied. "Trying to protect the door?" I interrupted. The cat's expression turned clueless as he answered, "That may be a fair guess. The king trusted him, apparently enough to guard it." Just then, the cat and mouse stopped dead in their tracks. It took me a moment to realize what had caught their attention. In the center of the room stood a framed slab of stone. The frame itself was riddled with diamonds and hearts, similar to the bookshelves while the slab was painted with beautiful red roses and vines. In the center of the slab, a medium-sized circle was missing from the picture, both mysteriously beautiful and oddly placed. I knew this was it, the door to Wonderhaven. If I had thought that it was impossible for me to be more speechless than I was when I entered the library, I would have been very wrong. I tuned out everything around me and wandered lifelessly closer to the door, as if seduced by the door's inaudible siren song. The closer I got to the stone slab, I was overcome by its majesty. As I placed a hand on it close to the missing piece, I whispered to myself, "This is it. It's all true. Wonderhaven, the crystal rose, it all exists." After I said that, I balled my hand into a fist and gently knocked against the slab before turning around and exclaiming, "We need to find that key." Just as those words left my mouth, a thunderous horn bellowed from outside the castle. "Looks like your attention is needed elsewhere, Your Majesty," Dormouse commented with a chuckle. In a sigh of irritation, I strode off, backtracking my way to the throne room. As the animals and I regrouped with the March Hare and the Tweedles, I ordered the whole group not to go far as I prepared to go outside and meet the new recruits. Chapter 12, Cat and Mouse Part 2. Truthfully, by the time I reached the doors to go outside, I was already riddled with nervousness. Although locating the door to Wonderhaven had been a daunting task, this recruitment would be unpredictable. In the case of the door, the answer was simple. It either existed, which we proved it did, or it didn't. The outcome of the task that waited just beyond the entrance of the castle was not so black and white. The odds of having 5 men standing before me were just as likely as having 100, 1,000, or even 10,000. Whether it be because the desperation of our situation or doubt seeping in, I was prepared for the worst of the likelihoods. I was preparing for the worst of the likelihoods. With a few deep breaths, I came outside and stood beside a knight in hesitation of looking at the number of troops that stood on the grounds below the steps. The reality of this number, however, was much more than I could have imagined. When I laid my eyes upon the truth, I was taken aback by the sight of hundreds of men, if not more, that stood silently waiting for direction. What I expected to be enough men for a small militia was actually a sea of armor that stretched to the edges of my vision. A small smile of confidence crossed my lips as the knight beside me whispered, "They are waiting for orders, my lord." Working through my surprise, I took a few steps forward to address the men. Let me start by saying that you have the wholehearted appreciation of the Queen and myself. I know it's not easy to leave behind everything you know, your homes and families. That's a lot to carry with you in your minds, but you answered the call in time of great need. I hope you know that in service to the crown, each and every one of you represents those things that matter most with honor and bravery. I paused a moment before continuing. As for your orders, they're simple because we don't have a lot of time. I don't think it needs to be said that our adversaries are dangerous and capable of untold devastation, which is why we need to take every defensive precaution we can. The longer we can prevent them from reaching our walls, the more time we'll have to do damage before they do. Your task is to fortify the castle with arrows, spears, and any other projectiles you can find. You are dismissed." Seconds after I finished speaking, the knight next to me barked for departure. "All right, gentlemen, let's get this done. Move out." The men responded with a simultaneous grunt of obedience. Soon the thunderous sound of marching drowned out my walk back inside the castle. I strode proudly into the throne room to find the rest of the Knights of the White Rose seated somberly around the room. Chesh was lying in the seat of the throne. The Tweedles were on the left side, enjoying their pipes, and the March Hare sat holding an empty teacup in his lap to the right. The one who drew my attention first, however, was the Dormouse, who was lying in the hare's cup, fidgeting with the rose necklace I had loaned him. I wasted little time in taking it back from him, and when I did, March Hare's ears perked up. With an excited giggle, he asked, "What's next?" "We find the key," I replied, in a serious tone, while putting the necklace in my pocket. "And how do you suppose we do that?" Chesh asked, crossing his paws. I was quick to fire back. "We already found the biggest piece to the puzzle. The key should be somewhere nearby." "That's a lot of castle to cover again," the Dormouse piped up. "Exactly, which is why we all need to search for it. Breaking off into teams of 2 will allow us to cover more ground in quicker fashion. You and Hare can search the dining room, the dining hall, and kitchen. Dee and Dum, you can search here, and Chesh and I will cover the hallway and armory. The keyhole on the door is a circle, so keep an eye out for something spherical, or that the necklace could fit into." As we all reached an agreement with that idea, we split up into the areas we were responsible for, and before long, the castle buzzed with activity from both inside and out. I left it up to the cat to decide where he would rather do his part in the hunt. He chose to weave through the rooms in the hallway, which meant I was left with the armory. However, instead of this being beneficial, I found it to be a distraction. I hadn't realized this since I came back, but this room was filled with the haunting memories from conflicts past. The walls housed each of our pieces of armor, no matter how bizarre. Everything from the Tweedle's shillelaghs to the Hare's ladle could be found hanging around the room. Among other miscellaneous weapons and armor, I spotted a staff. It was Hatter's. I couldn't help but take a moment to lay a hand on it, hoping that by some form of magic, doing so would cause my friend to materialize. Of course, when he didn't, I took my hand away, shaking my head at such a ridiculous idea. It wasn't until I came across what sat next to Hatter's staff that I became fully swept up by memories. It was my armor, the legendary gauntlets and breastplate. Although they had lain dormant for several years, they were just as I remembered them. Covered in dings, dents, and symbols, they looked as though my battle with the Red Queen was just the previous day. As with the staff, I felt unable to resist placing a hand on the breastplate. This time, instead of seeing a prophetic vision like the one that plagued me when I first touched the Vorpal blade, an overwhelming feeling of purpose came over me. It was as though Alice herself became present in the armor, and we both knew what must be done. At that moment, I recalled how apprehensive I was to wear her armor when I first laid eyes on it. Now, not knowing what horrors Wonderhaven might hold, all apprehension of this was gone. It was no longer just armor. It was a friend, my connection to the little that came before me. I knew that as I fought in the unknown world behind the door, in the apocalypse of Wonderland, she would be with me now, until the end. Making that deep connection with the armor had shown me that while it was inappropriate to do so at the current time, it was the perfect time to put it on. In the larger scheme of things, a series of great tribulations was soon to come, and I was going to be ready to meet them head on. Just as I finished suiting up, I heard a commotion coming from the throne room. It sounded like a muffled argument. This prompted me to give up my search for anything that may have been a key to investigate the disturbance. Coming briskly down the hallway, the voices got louder, and when I reached the end, I could see that the rest of the group had given up their search to investigate as well. Chesh had beaten me there and tried to make a snide comment about my armor, specifically me in the armor, but his attempt was cut off by a raised hand as I focused in on the source of the dispute. What I focused on was the Tweedles, one on each arm of the throne. They appeared to be arguing over the full moon-shaped jewel embedded in the back of the throne. You know, it just occurred to me that in all the times I've been around the throne so far in the story, I failed to share what it looks like in detail. It was a regal chair for a regal woman. It was the only black thing she possessed, though it was still accented with small white roses that looked similar to the necklace. The backrest was rounded and curved, so it was as though you were sitting in a flower while being surrounded by its petals. In the center of the backrest was a moon-shaped orb that the twins were fighting about. Though impossible to be comfortable, it was the focal point of the chair. "Don't be stupid, it's too obvious," I heard Dum yell. This was followed soon after by Dee's crass rebuttal. "Don't be so blind, it's exactly what Alan said. It's spherical, and there's a place for the necklace to go." Insults were hurled fast and furiously, as the brothers jockeyed to prove who was right. Their feud was only quelled when I stepped in to mediate. Upon examining the finer details of the throne, I did discover that one of the tiny white roses above the jewel was missing. "I think you both have valid points," I reassured. "It is very obvious, but only obvious to us because we know what we're looking for. What good is a key when the door it unlocks is hidden? Moreover, what good is a key when the most important piece spends all of its time around the neck of the queen?" "Ha! I knew this was it," exclaimed Dee, feeling his victory on the matter slip away. "Dumb question, but how do we know for sure?" Taking the necklace out of my pocket, I answered, "There's only one way." As I placed the tiny rose necklace into the empty space, we all seemed to hold our breath in anticipation. At first nothing happened, but after a brief moment the orbish jewel in question came to life. It began to glow with a brilliant light. Then, rather unexpectedly, it came loose from its resting place in the chair. As it rolled gently into my hands, the expressions on everyone's faces turned into disbelief, as we all took a collective gasp. I believe you were right, my brother," Dum admitted in a sort of mesmerized nervousness. "I believe we have found our key," I interrupted. "Follow me," I said, releasing the necklace and returning it to my pocket. Just like that, I was leading the group toward the location of the door, magical glowing orb in hand. If you could have seen how easily I navigated the path this time, you'd probably never believe that I had done it only once before. I led them eagerly down the dungeon staircase, my excitement carrying me through the darkness with reckless abandon. When we reached the stone wall, I unlocked the mechanisms with the speed of one very familiar. I could hear the jaws of the twins and the hair drop as they watched the wall give way to the hidden hallway. Their bewilderment only became more audible when we entered the bishop's library. The two who had been there before followed me to the door, while the other three took some extra time to look around as I did before. Eventually, we all regrouped in front of the door. While I was directly in front of it, the rest of the gang stayed back, waiting for what would happen next. I held the jewel in front of the door, frozen in place. "Well, go on, put the jewel in the door," urged Chesh, interrupting my concentration. I turned to say something, but when I did, the jewel came to life. Hovering just above my hand now, it leapt forward, throwing itself into the empty space in the center of the door. We all thought this behavior was strange, and nobody knew how to react. It didn't matter, though, because before anybody could, the stone slab started to react. It began by sucking the light out of the jewel. When the door was fully lit and the orb grew dark, the painted roses started to change. The red of the flowers themselves began to run, leaking all over the green vines they rested on. This continued until the roses were snow white and the vines turned blood red. When the new painting was complete, the slab began to move, shifting over to the side, as the stone wall did in the dungeon. What we faced now was an empty white void, waiting to be entered. The entrance to Wonderhaven had been opened. While all we could do was stare in awe at the myth and legend come to life, I thought out loud and directly, "Do you believe now?" My question went unanswered by the group for a while, but Dee was the first to rediscover the ability to speak. "Do you want us to come with you, Alan?" He answered with concern. "No," I answered sternly. "This is a journey I must make on my own. Besides, the war is not far from now, and the men will need guidance until I come back." But we can't lead," Dee had started to plead before I cut him off. "I leave them in the capable hands of the Knights of the White Rose," I said with a smile. "I'll be back as soon as I can. It's important that you all be here for the Queen." "We have no time to debate this," Chesh barked. We will do what we must. Just make sure you're back before it's over." "Naturally," I replied, still smiling. "Make sure you give the dormouse some tea." "Naturally," replied the cat in a devilish grin. I directed my closing statement for the group as a whole. I directed my closing statement to the group as a whole. "For Wonderland," I said, turning again to face the door. "For Wonderland," they answered in unison as I ran into the light and the stone slab shut in place behind me. That's another episode down for us, guys. It's taken us a while, but we have officially crossed the halfway point. So I hope that you have enjoyed it thus far, and I hope you're still with me as we go into the back half of the story. So until next time, we'll see you in the next video.